Hello and welcome to Vetting America. I'm your host, Adam T. Cummings, and we're live at Armature Works in the beautiful city of Tampa Bay, Florida. I am so grateful to have you all here today to listen to stories of service, sacrifice, transition, and transformation with amazing individuals who are doing great things in our community and improving lives around the entire country. I'd be so grateful if you could continue to support us by first visiting our YouTube channel and subscribing, and then also to visit us at vettingamerica.com to learn more about our mission, to learn more about our purpose, and to learn more about the resources and organizations that are out there improving lives in the veteran and military space. Let's jump right into it. Today's show features Lieutenant Commander Mark Fettermen, who continues to serve in the United States Navy since 2005. He's currently the co-founder of the Homefront Foundation, which teaches service members, veterans, and their families how to tell their story. He's also program director of Mission United, which is designed to create a network of collaborative service providers. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Mark.
Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate you being here. So let's just talk a little bit about before you joined the military, and were you always interested in joining, or you kind of just fell into it?
Yeah, so I grew up in Plymouth, Massachusetts. It's the hometown of America, really. I mean, it's a small town, really rural still, but very patriotic. So that was kind of always something in the background. But when I grew up, my dad was a mechanic, my mom was a hairdresser, and I remember growing up, we always talked about the military, but it was nobody in our family served, and everybody was kind of doing other things. And I think the reason I ended up going into the military or going to the academy actually was simply because college was expensive. It just kind of turned out that way, and I started looking at all my options. And this one evening, I went to an information session, and it was the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. There's 5 federal service academies. West Point was standing here, Naval Academy, Air Force Academy, and then you see all these parents are sitting there asking these questions for their alma mater, getting their kids to go. But like I said, my parents were a mechanic and a hairdresser. We didn't really even know the questions to ask, but I did start to get interested there and realize I can go to school pretty much for free with the obligation of military service after. So that's kind of how I ended up getting into the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy and started my career into the military as well.
So getting your education first was very important to you, and it was a must. Was that your idea? Was that your parents' idea? Why did you decide to go officer and not go enlisted?
So I never really gave this too much thought as far as officer or enlisted, but I remember when in high school I worked in construction, and I remember just working construction every day, day in and day out up on a roof in the summer and digging holes. And I just said, I think this is something that's really not going to work for me for a career. And the best way I thought of a way out of that was, to get an education. But like I said, college was expensive, so the academy offered me that education, but also something else, and that was really what attracted me to it.
So tell us a little bit about what military academy was like, and did that help you going into OCS? I have a couple friends that went through OCS now, and it's no joke. And so, was it a culture shock? Did you feel prepared to lead warfighters after graduating? Things like that.
That's actually a really good question, whether or not you're prepared. So through the service academies, you go through an indoctrination. It's much like a condensed boot camp, and it should get you ready to be at the academy. It gives you the very basics of how to be in the military, uniformity, understand the culture a little bit. But it's over the next 4 years that you actually start to develop the skills and actually start to really develop your leadership styles and philosophies. And whether or not I think I was actually fully prepared to, go active duty is, I think everybody's a little different. And I think what we end up saying is we think we're prepared, and then next thing you know, we get faced with a challenge we never thought we would have. But either way, I think the academy gives you the basis to make those good, value-informed decisions.
So I know I had a bunch of second lieutenants come in. We called them butter bars, and when I was a PFC Lance Corporal, I respected them, but then when I was a salty sergeant, I was like, oh, these guys don't know what they're talking about. But on the other end of that, what's it like for a young ensign to be thrown into a leadership role that early in their life, that early in their career? with sailors who have been there, they've done that, they've been around the world. How was that dichotomy, and how were you able to kind of create your own way of leading these people who have been led by so many others?
So when we're at the academy, we have a commandant and midshipman, and this one guy really sticks out and, for me, and he was only there for 1 year while I was. His name was Captain Athens. And he ended up telling us this story one time, and it was about leadership and how does a young officer lead these, battle-hardened Marines. Actually, was the story. It was going back to Vietnam. Mm-hmm. So this young second lieutenant gets placed into a Vietnam unit, and he goes up to his senior NCO and he says, how can I actually lead these men who've seen battle, who've done all this? And the senior NCO sits him down and he says, 3 things. He says, you need to show courage in battle, show that you actually have this fortitude to lead, show compassion, show that you actually understand and you're listening to your men and women. And really the other thing is courage, competence, and competence. Mm-hmm. He says you have to show that you're actually knowledgeable. You don't have to know everything, but through a sense of humility and leaning on your senior NCOs and the other men and women who've been there in the unit before, I think that's leaning on those 3 things really makes you actually able to lead.
I like that a lot. Those are really great pieces of advice. Tell us a little bit about your career. I mean, you're still hooking and jabbing, doing your thing. What did you do? Where did you go? What did you learn? Give us a couple stories. And what are some of the tools you continue to leverage every day of your life that you've picked up while you've begun and continue this career in the military?
So when I got commissioned out of the academy, we actually had this really interesting deal. We're allowed to actually go into the reserves, but actually work in the Merchant Marine. And the Merchant Marine is actually it's a commercial shipping groups. So what I did is I went in to work for ConocoPhillips, an oil and gas distribution company. And what we were doing is we were sailing ships up to Valdez, Alaska, and bringing oil back down to the U.S. But at the same time, I was in the reserves. So I was going to my reserve unit, and I was doing different kinds of drills and doing different things. But I remember I was about 28. So it was about 5 years after I graduated from the academy, and I remember saying to myself, I don't want the best thing I've done in my life to be graduating from the academy.
Yes.
I want some sort of other challenge. And shortly before, one of my good friends from the academy, he had gone to Afghanistan. He was killed in Mazar Sharif.
Sorry to hear that.
And it kind of just spurred this whole, I want to ask more of myself. So I raised my hand again and I volunteered to mobilize to go to Afghanistan. And the interesting thing is, it was back in the time when there really wasn't too many hoops to jump through when it was time to get into this surge. So I changed my status from involuntary to voluntary, and within 24 hours, I had orders. I had 24 hours to have orders on my desk, and I looked at them, I couldn't believe it. As an engineer, it was pretty sought after resume, so next thing you know, I was in Afghanistan, and about 6 months later, with an Army infantry platoon, and working up in the mountains of Pakistan. It was pretty interesting and quite a shift.
I bet.
Yeah.
So you decided to continue serving while you're out. You're doing a lot of things for military families, doing a lot of things for veterans. Why did you decide to not fully transition out of the military, kind of have that 1 foot in, 1 foot out? And do you feel that that's actually going to help you fully transition when it's time to go on to greener pastures?
That's an interesting question. And I've kind of even asked myself this, do I sometimes stay in the reserves simply because it's a part of my identity and it's something I don't want to really let go of? Or is it really just a really good financial decision and it allows me to actually still serve my country that I love? And I think it's more the latter. I think it allows me to keep serving. Yes, my military career is part of my identity. It's changed my perspective and it's a part of who I am. But I think the transition is understanding that that's just a piece of the puzzle, and it's just a piece of what makes me whole. The military service is one thing, but what do I do in addition to that?
Yes.
Who's Mark? Beyond the roles of his uniform, his rank, and maybe even the role or title that we have within our workplace.
Do you feel officers have a leg up in their transition because they have already have the educational background, the connections, they have a little bit better resume, quote unquote, than an enlisted personnel? Do you feel that they are more prepared for transition, or do you think it is a case-by-case basis?
So I've seen some officers do a fantastic job transitioning, and I've seen some enlisted do a fantastic job, but at the same time I've seen both on a case-by-case basis. I think the biggest thing is answering the question when an employer asks you is, what do you want to do now? What do you want to be? And having a really concrete answer there, I think that could really make a big difference for a lot of people, because it's understanding what you want.
Yes.
What do you want now? What do you want to do in the future? And I know it's difficult either way, but I've seen some enlisted individuals do stellar jobs with answering that question, and next thing you know, they're walking right into these very high-level jobs, and I've seen some officers who do a terrible job at it. It's more of a case-by-case basis, I think.
You have two businesses that you're a part of, so you're an entrepreneur. Do you feel that that is an important route for some veterans that may be lost to go down when they're in their transition, to help them transform? Do you feel that alongside still serving the country, still being in the lieutenant commander role, still now being an entrepreneur, but still having a very solid footing in the civilian sector, how do you see that kind of all coming together and playing with it and playing along with itself to help you transcend and transform into the person that you've always were meant to be once you finally take those boots off and that uniform off for the last time?
So my transition is a little different than even some others, because I was a reserve officer almost my whole career, other than when I went on active duty, but I would always come back to being a reservist. And while I was looking at grad schools, I looked at USC. I went to University of Southern California for the Master's of Business program. And one of the core subjects was entrepreneurship. I had never considered myself an entrepreneur in any sense. I always found myself in the corporate sector kind of doing employee roles. But what I started to realize is the entrepreneur mentality is something I think we can all embrace, whether or not we actually start our own company or if we become entrepreneurial working within our employment. I think that it's definitely something that most military members have, because we have to be adaptable. I've never been in a role that I was actually fully trained for in the military. I was always told, here's the role you're going to be filled, left seat, right seat, you got it. I had it, you got it. And next thing you know, I start to lean on those entrepreneurial assets that we have in the military, which is a bias for action and the willingness to accept a challenge. So I think that's really important for everybody to say, is whether or not I want to be an entrepreneur owning my own business, or whether or not I just kind of want to see what kind of qualities I actually have that make up being entrepreneurial as it is.
I feel you have a very unique perspective that I have yet to be able to capture in the story and interviews I do for Vetting America. I like to talk a lot about the resources and strategies and therapies and tool sets that people can leverage in transition to help them transform. You being still in the military, you being very active in the veteran organization and resource sector of the community, what are some resources that you don't hear about a lot in the veteran community that you have found to be really, really helpful, considering that you have that perspective of the military and you also have that perspective of civilian life? What are some organizations, some resources, some therapies, and things you've seen that don't get a lot of they don't get highlighted enough in our community?
So I think everybody's different, and everybody's going to be looking for something different. We see Action Zone helping the entrepreneurial mindset, helping these individuals leverage that piece. Some people really aren't even looking for that. I think the number one thing people can do, regardless of what kind of resources they're looking for, is build out a network and actually start to really reach out to individuals, not with just an email or just on LinkedIn, but actually call these people, get informational interviews, and start to look at somebody you actually respect in the corporate sector or civilian world that maybe this is a role you'd want to fill. And I keep going back towards employment as success, because we need to be getting busy again. When we get out of the military, we need to be engaged. But when you start to see these leaders in the corporate world or civilian world, look at what they've done in the past and start to see, like, what kind of wickets do I have to go through to actually fill that kind of a role? So I think building out that network, getting those informational interviews, and really determining what it is that you really want to do now.
You're a master storyteller. I've heard you tell a story before. You're humble, I get it. But I remember we were at that, it was last year, it was at that Rising Tides, the Sip and Sign event that they had. And you got to tell an amazing Whiskey and War Stories, and you told an amazing story. And I feel, as we've talked a lot about and what you focus on, storytelling is so key in transitioning and transforming and in anybody's life, whether you're civilian, military, whatever it is you do. So tell us a story about a time you felt a little lost, maybe a little alone. Maybe it was when you were in Afghanistan deployed, maybe it was when you're at home, where you have one foot in, one foot out, you really don't know what to do. And how are you able to get back up on your feet and start building the life to where you are today?
So you had an interesting guest before, Scott Mann, with the hero's journey and his last out elegy of a Green Beret. He's doing some fantastic things too, and I think Scott and my twin brother Matt and I, we all believe that storytelling is actually going to be one of the greatest assets the veteran can have. You know, being able to not just translate your skills and experiences for someone, but actually being able to relate. We often hear is, well, you weren't there, so you wouldn't know. So we see veterans starting to just, have conversations with other veterans. But what I say is when you can tell your story and you're allowed to actually connect a word to an emotion and actually really start to change the words of your story to become your experience, I think it's really important. And the thing you're touching on right there is, asking, a time I felt maybe alone or a little lost is vulnerability.
Yes.
And in the military, last thing we ever want to be considered is vulnerable. But actually, I think that's what makes us human. It makes us real. It makes us actually be able to relate. And the story that I go to was when I was leaving Afghanistan. So it was 2011, it was the summer, and it was a hot, hot day. And I was standing on this flight line with my rucksack on, and it was bearing down on my shoulders. And I mean, I was sweating so bad, it was like somebody just turned the faucet on. And I'm standing there in the line, and I was happy. This day was one of the best days of this whole deployment because we're going home. But more than that, everyone on my team had made it.
Yes.
Everybody was going home. So I looked up this ramp, the C-17, and all of a sudden we get the order to go ahead and start loading the plane 2 by 2 in an orderly fashion. So we start walking up this ramp, and I drop this rucksack down, and I take a seat, and the individuals right next to me take a seat too. And so we fly out of Afghanistan and out of Bagram, we go up over the mountains, and we come back down into another desert. It's Kuwait. And that's where the Navy transitions out. We go through our warrior transition program. And this is where I grab that rucksack off the plane, and I go into the processing center, and they say, hey, sailor, you got to take that uniform off. And that happy feeling then leaving Afghanistan really changed quickly. They said, you can't fly home in uniform because you're flying out of Kuwait International Airport. So I couldn't fly home in the uniform I was wearing to serve my country for the last year. And I take the uniform off, and I fly out, and I land in San Diego. San Diego was home at the time, and when we land, all of a sudden the flight attendant comes on, and everybody starts standing up to grab their baggage out of the overhead and using their cell phones. And that 2 by 2 orderly fashion from Afghanistan changed. And it changed from order to chaos. And I had a window seat, thank God. Well, anyways, I end up unloading from the plane, and I'm standing at the baggage carousel, and next thing you know, the alarm goes off. And the alarm was the exact same alarm as incoming, only 72 hours before.
Wow.
So I just see this carousel going by, and everybody's rushing up to grab their bags and, running off on their day. And finally, that sea bag that was weighing down on my shoulders in Afghanistan, I walk up and I finally grab onto it, and I held onto it because I felt that lost and I felt alone. Well, from there, I got a cab, and I went and lived in a hotel room for about 3 weeks by myself. And I think the one way I got out of that hotel room was my brother.
Yeah.
My brother came knocking on the door. And the reason I tell you the story is there are veterans, there are military members who do feel lost and alone, and even their family members. Sometimes all we need to do is just reach out.
Reach out.
Just say hello and ask their story and see how they're doing. It's not even that hard. It's just sometimes we avoid it.
I believe that 100%. And that story was amazing. Thank you for sharing that with us. Now you have the Homefront Foundation, which is all about telling those kinds of stories. Why do you feel it's paramount for a successful transition and transformation to own your vulnerability, to tell those stories, and to not only help others through them, but truly let yourself be free finally from the weight that always had? How did you come up with the idea for the Homefront Foundation, and how did that come to be?
So when I was in grad school, I was introduced to storytelling for business. A lot of top tier executives and CEOs are taught storytelling to create change in their business and sell products or move teams. And I was introduced to it, and I saw this, and I said, well, what if we can actually use this as a method for veterans and military members to transition home and to actually understand some of the things that they've experienced and actually make sense of it, a little more than just over a beer in a dark pool hall with battle buddies. Actually say, Hollywood is not doing it. Hollywood's not telling our story. We have to be the ones to tell our own story. So my twin brother and I, we saw this model, and we started to flip it around and change it a little bit to actually help veterans tell their story. We think it's so important because as military members, we have to view ourselves as leaders. We see that from day one when we take our oath and when we walk in through the front doors, and we always are practicing leadership. But there's two things that I never have seen the military really focus on when they're teaching us leadership. It's being authentic and vulnerable. And when I say vulnerable, like we were saying before, it doesn't mean out of control. It doesn't mean any of that. It just means actually being human. And then being authentic is knowing your true self. And the way to do that, we think, is just by telling your story. Understanding where you've been and where you want to be going, and understanding how you can relate to the people across the table from you, or the ones you're just interacting with every day.
Do you feel that you being the beacon, by going out there telling your story first, making it almost a normal progression of transition and transformation, do you feel that you are the man you've always meant to be sitting in front of us today? And do you feel that a lot of veterans, if they can learn to own their vulnerabilities and their authenticity, can become the men and women that they've always were destined to be?
So as a beacon, I'm not sure. I mean, I think actually it's when I learned how to tell my story, and now I continually trying to figure out how to tell more of my stories, I realize more about myself.
Yes.
And I think it goes back to the Kolb learning cycle. William Kolb is a doctor. He says we learn things through experience, reflection, iteration, and then conceptualization. And what we've noticed is we typically will go through an experience and then we'll jump right back into another experience, but we don't take the time to reflect. And when we were kids, some of my friends, these girls, they had diaries. They were taking this time to actually reflect, to see who they were in this experience. But learning how to tell your story, you're forced to reflect, and you're forced to take this time. And I think it leads you to the question of who am I and who do I want to be? So I think learning how to tell your story really does help you get to those answers.
Would that be your sage piece of advice to somebody transitioning out of the military, or do you feel that there's something else you'd like to tell a veteran or someone who's about to get out of the military, a great nugget of truth and wisdom that you've picked up along the way that could help them ease their pain and suffering and create the life that they've always been destined to create for themselves?
The best person to give advice to would be my younger self. And I think my younger self, I think what I would probably give as an advice is consider yourself resilient always. The victim mentality is not going to serve any of us. Being resilient and having the courage to learn how to tell your story, I think is probably one of the most important things that we can do as we make a transition. And the thing is, we're also not going to have one transition in our life. We're going to have many. And it's really just a fork in the road. Which way do you want to go? Which path are you going to choose? And I think the idea of transition being the only, transitioning from active duty to a civilian or a veteran role, it's wrong. I think we have to understand that it's the resilience that we lean on and understanding our story that allows us to make these multiple transitions in our lives. What careers you're going to pick next,
Tell us a little bit about Mission United in your role as director of that, and how do people leverage it for success? Where do you see it improving the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Tampa Bay and across the country, and where do you see the future going with that program?
So I've been with Mission United now for a little more than a year and a half or so, and really the idea is when we look at the veteran space, there's a lot of nonprofits that are doing great work. The only problem is how to navigate those nonprofits is really difficult, and then there's a lack of collaboration within some other nonprofits that it's really not necessary. What we need to do is we need to start to collaborate these great organizations to start to actually do more good. And the best example I could ever give was I saw Gangs of New York, that movie.
That's great.
And they're running up to put out this fire, and there's all these fire trucks that are running in. They're trying to put out the fire as different departments, and they're all throwing buckets on, and it just looked like they're all doing the work, but they're not really doing it together. And it's not necessarily a battle for space. It's actually just trying to do more good for the greater good of the veterans.
And so how does I truly believe in I have my hands in multiple pots doing multiple things. I think it's just kind of like a veteran military mentality when you just have so many different jobs that it's kind of becomes part of you, ingrained in you. How's the Homefront Foundation and what you're doing with Mission United kind of working together to accomplish both missions, which is helping families and veterans and active duty service members tell their stories while also connecting them with the right nonprofits and helping these nonprofits collaborate towards success? I feel like there's linearness to that.
Yeah, and I definitely think there is too, because that's why I took the role. So basically, Mission United is actually connecting veterans to services, but then there's also there's 5 focus areas that we've really focused on too, which is employment. Really, we want to make sure veterans are getting into a meaningful career that has opportunity for advancement. And the next is family and caregivers. It's often an overlooked group of individuals who really are the support mechanisms. I mean, our military strength starts at home.
Foundation.
So transition, it's a process, not an event. Benefits, our benefits are earned. And then finally, this is really where I think the most synergy is changing the narrative. Often we hear this narrative pushed out by the media, by some others, that it's around that victim mentality, and it's around this dichotomy of all heroes or all broken, and neither of which is true. I mean, most people I'll sit across from, especially veterans, find themselves somewhere in the middle and just kind of want to find that next role. Well, to change the narrative, like I said, I think it's going to require men and women, veterans, the family members, to tell that authentic, real story, the honest, true story. And that's really where I think we make the most movement.
So how do we find you on social media? How do we learn more about the Homefront Foundation, about Mission United, and about Mark Fettermen?
So really, just like most others, I'm actually trying to get myself more involved in social media. But we have a couple websites. The homefrontfoundation.org, United Way Suncoast. It's where we have Mission United, and then you can probably find us on our Facebook pages as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mark, for coming on the show.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone at home. This is Lieutenant Commander Mark Fettermen, still serving in the United States Navy. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. That wraps up another edition of Vetting America, and I can't wait to see you again all soon. Thank you.
My name's Lieutenant Commander Mark Fettermen. If you enjoyed this interview, please subscribe to Vetting America's YouTube channel.